Allow a few more folks to settle into the Zoom before I kick things off. Hey everyone, thanks for joining us this afternoon for today's discussion, Can We Save American Democracy? Hosted by the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. My name's Archon Fung. I'm the Winfield Latham McCormick Professor of Citizenship and Self-Government at the Kennedy School and Director of the Ash Center. I have to start by thanking everyone joining for your patience and persistence. This event was originally scheduled for February and then moved to April, proving that democracy isn't the only thing under threat these days. Our April attempt was derailed by a national Zoom outage. It's taken us 3 tries, but as they say, third tries a charm. So on behalf of the Ash Center, and especially after all of the calendar drama, I'm grateful for everyone joining us today. Before we begin, the Ash Center acknowledges that the land on which Harvard University sits is the traditional territory of the Massachusetts people. We also recognize the continuing presence of the neighboring Wampanoag and Nipmuc nations. A couple of logistical points. Today's discussion is being recorded and you'll receive a link afterwards. The recording will also be available on the Ash Center's YouTube channel. We encourage your participation. Please submit your questions anytime via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll reserve ample time for questions and answers. I should say that the point of this webinar is to have a discussion that everybody learns from, not to endorse or urge any specific point of view. Let me briefly introduce our panelists. Their full bios are online. Steve Levitsky is my colleague, the David Rockefeller Professor of Latin American Studies and a Professor of Government over in the department here at Harvard. And Virginia Kase Solomón is President and CEO of Common Cause. By way of disclosure and transparency, I should let everyone know that I serve on the National Governing Board of Common Cause. For those not familiar, Common Cause is a nonpartisan grassroots organization that's been operating for open and accountable government since 1970. All right, so with that, let's get on to the subject. Steve, you published a great article with Luke and Wei a little while ago in Foreign Affairs titled The Path to Authoritarianism, in which you argued that U.S. democracy will likely break down during the second Trump administration. And we're going to talk a lot about whether it has or not and whether your prediction will come true. You say that the United States will likely cease to meet the standard criteria for liberal democracy: full adult suffrage, free and fair elections, and broad protection of civil liberties. Virginia, as head of Common Cause, you and your team, your sizable team, work tirelessly to help ensure that Steve's prediction does not come true. So the big question for this afternoon's discussion is Steve Levitsky wrong? All right. Or will he be? So before we jump into that, we've got hundreds of people, 430 people in the audience right now. And I wanted to do just a moment of audience participation in the form of a Zoom poll. So, okay, here's the question. Imagine the United States 5 years from now in 2030. What do you expect it to be like, democratically speaking? Okay, so I've just launched the poll, and as you answer, let me read through the options for you. One is it's going to be competitive authoritarian, and Steve's prediction comes true. America will be substantially less small d democratic. The second is polarized precariousness. Things kind of stay like they are now: shaky, angry, unstable, with Republicans and Democrats highly polarized, one side or the other trying to change the rules of politics. 3 is back to normal. This is the promise of the 2020 Biden campaign to return politics to normal, something like maybe America from the 1970s to the 2010s. This on number 3, the fever will break. And then number 4 is a rebirth of democracy. Things will start to get better 5 years from now in a new way. Perhaps corruption will decrease, leaders will become more responsive and less remote, local and maybe even national politics will be revitalized. Okay, so those are the 3 options. I'll wait about 30 more seconds, and then I'll end the poll. A bunch of people are still voting. All right. And we will link this results as a PDF that people can look at afterwards. Um, all right. So can people can probably see the poll, right? Can you guys see the poll? Hopefully. The first vote getter is polarized precariousness. Most people, 150 out of about 400, think things will stay like they are with these kind of crazy swings and the anger and the fear and the instability. And then the second vote getter with 120 is competitive authoritarianism. Steve's prediction comes true. And then, but interestingly, not far behind is rebirth of democracy with 105 people thinking that maybe things will start to get a little bit better in 5 years. And then amazingly, only 8 people think that we'll return to anything like the kind of Carter to second term Biden or second term Obama normal. Very, very few people. Okay, great. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to end the poll. Share the results. Oh, I guess you couldn't see them. There they are. Okay, let's go on to the discussion. Um, Steve's argument is that the Trump administration is following in the footsteps of many other authoritarian leaders around the world and the steps that they have taken to undermine democracy in their societies and lock in their own power. Let's explore some of the moves in the authoritarian playbook, what a lot of people have called it, and whether they're happening in the United States. So, Steve, in your article, you list many ways in which President Trump might use the powers of government to weaken political opponents. And this was back in February. How much of what you were worried about has actually happened? And of all the stuff that has happened, what are you most concerned about?
Great questions. I should say we actually wrote the piece came out in February. We wrote it in December before Trump took office, so
Oh,
we
okay.
didn't know. Um, it has been considerably worse than we anticipated even in December. Trump has weaponized, meaning purged and packed public institutions, everything from the DOJ and the FBI to the Education Department and Homeland Security, purged them, packed them with loyalists, and deployed them in a really systematic way to punish critics, to weaken rivals, and to bully business, the media, much of civil society into a degree of self-censorship or onto the political sidelines. There have been hundreds of investigations launched against critics, media, universities, politicians, even judges. There have been lawsuits against media organizations. There have been attacks on universities, including Harvard. There have been outright arrests of opposition politicians, and a lot of subtle pressure on media companies and donors and this will get to what I'm most concerned about, in ways that may tilt the playing field. So one point that I think is really important is that this is not only is it worse than I anticipated in December, and I was kind of a pessimist. This is a lot worse than most other competitive authoritarian regimes that have emerged in the 21st century. The degree of abuse that has occurred in the first 7 months of the administration is much, much more severe than Orban in Hungary during his first year, than Hugo Chavez in Venezuela during his first year, than the AKP government during its first year in Turkey. It took years before you saw this level of routinized abuse and attacks on civil society and the opposition. This is not to say that any of this is permanent or that it's not reversible. I think it's quite reversible, but the degree of abuse of power is stunning and is considerably worse than other authoritarian regimes. Um, I, I think two things worried me the most. One is the sort of unseen secondary effects of all this punishment. So you see, there are some things that we see very high profile, that the raid on John Bolton's house, or the attack on Lisa Cook in the Fed, but the systematic the signaling effect of these efforts to use government retribution to bully critics and rivals is having kind of a multiplier effect in society, such that many law firms are thinking twice about representing progressive organizations. Many donors are thinking twice and even three times about funding certain institutions or certain civil society organizations or certain candidates that may oppose the government. And that's hard to see. And you also see people, young talent, people with talent who might have become investigative journalists or might have become opinion columnists or might have joined a certain law firm or might have run for Congress, who decide it's not worth it. I don't want to take the risk of getting out there right now and engaging in political battle. And it's hard to see those decisions. It's hard to see people silently retreating to the sideline. And that's one of the things that worries me. The other thing that worries me, which I didn't anticipate, was the dramatic expansion of ICE and the willingness of the government to really defy the law, to just sort of walk away from due process and defy the law. That goes beyond what we write about in competitive authoritarianism, and could potentially take us in an even darker place. I mean, you've heard, I'm sure the audience has heard that the funding for ICE and Homeland Security is now greater than any other military budget in the world outside of our own and China's. This is a massive investment in a security force that's not well regulated, that's not very professionalized, and that can be deployed in a centralized way by the government. Now, we don't know for sure. We don't really know for sure what they're aiming at with this investment, but it's a very powerful tool if they decide that they want to use it to consolidate power.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Steve. On the comparative point, I think it's really useful for people living and growing up in the United States to know that it does seem worse than in a lot of other societies that you've looked at. I remember after Rumesa Ozturk was arrested and sent to Louisiana, somebody was telling me about a conversation they had in a cafe in Hungary. And the conversation was, wow, I didn't know the government could just throw people in the back of a van. And this is like Orban a decade in, right? And so that was a little eye-opening for me. For following up on that, your point about the secondary effects and the silencing, this is a question for Virginia. So the administration has targeted many opponents. Not many, although some have gone to jail in terms of political opponents. So how do you think about Steve's comments? I mean, in some ways, it seems like the administration's actions are putting a little bit of wind in the sails of Common Cause because many Americans are upset about what's going on. But then do you see the silencing and the threats? Do you see moves that might threaten Common Cause? And if so, what are your strategies for countering them?
Yeah, I mean, and thanks so much, Archon, for putting this together. And obviously being with Steve, who's just, you know, I stand over a little bit on the books because I'm a little bit of a nerd like that. So, Steve, appreciate all of that you've done. I think one of the things that we have to be reminded of, and we were founded 55 years ago to be the people's lobby because everybody had representation in Washington and in state capitals around the country, except for everyday people. And so that was our goal, to be the lobby for the people. And our tagline is we hold power accountable. And so we realized that this was our mission moment, that we shouldn't pull back, that we have to use our voices to push forward. And Archon, you as a board member, you also know that we've had a lot of conversations about risk. What is the risk level that we're willing to tolerate? And I remember being at a board meeting, and one of our board members asking me, how comfortable are you with being a target? And I said, I knew that Donald Trump could get elected again when I took this job. If I wasn't comfortable with that, then I shouldn't be here. And I think one of the things I just want to start with is that this is a moment for us to be courageous more than anything else, that we cannot allow them to put fear in our hearts. That's the most important thing, that we have a responsibility. If you choose to do this work, and this is a choice that I've made for my life, My family understands this choice. Those are deep conversations that you need to have. So you have to be able to be okay with standing up and dealing with the consequences of what I believe is a very righteous fight for us on people who are democracy activists. But the attacks on nonprofit status is really important, our tax exempt status. I think that's something that we have to be aware of, because there have been executive orders, and there is the idea that if we weaken or we make people fearful that they could be deemed a terrorist organization if they are standing up for civil rights, whether it's the situation with Palestine or Black Lives Matter or you name it, that somehow, or even if you're just engaged generally in protest, these attacks on First Amendment rights are putting nonprofits at greater risk these days. The threats to DEI, I find it funny. Name a person who isn't DEI, and I think it's the smallest group. I have a T-shirt that says you're probably DEI too, because a lot of people don't realize that they're part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion community. But I think the threats to DEI, this idea that somehow we diminish people's qualifications by claiming that they're quote unquote like a diversity hire, as though people didn't have to work equally or twice as hard to be able to get through and overcome some of the systemic barriers that have existed. So kind of the discrediting of organizations because you can just throw a name at them like they're a DEI hire. The attacks on our partner organizations, which is something that I want to name. All of the organizations who do this work, we work in coalition, we work as partners. And so I'll not name the organization because I don't know who's on this Zoom, but it makes it, unsafe. But I've had partner orgs who have been doing this good government work, who have been named from in the Oval Office because they filed lawsuits around transparency and accountability. And they're dealing with private security having to be at their homes and making sure that they're safe, because there are people who actually have been giving physical and threats online to those individuals. That security now for people who are just good government activists is now at stake. The attacks on law firms that represent a lot of our cases when we file an amicus brief, if we're trying to put together some kind of an injunction on a bad order, or even if we're proactively in affirmative litigation, those law firms now are fearful to represent organizations like ours. And there are some really great ones who have shown up. But the impact for us is we have to be more creative. We have to have other partners in this space who are willing to be courageous. And then the attacks on our funding base. I think when you see that there is a community of foundations and others who have invested in just good government and democracy in the past, which should not be controversial, right? That is not something that should be controversial. Yet those funders are under attack. They are being investigated. So when you think about the threats, it's not necessarily always the direct threats to us. It is the threat of us being able to do our work because of all of these other attacks that are happening simultaneously. Now, what I will say, and the biggest hope for me in all of this work, is that our funding for us to be able to do this, while we have not seen a big increase in foundation funding because foundations are struggling, small dollar donors. I'm talking about everyday people, even in this economy, people who have sent us notes and have said, look, I only have $25 to give, and that, that's going to cut my grocery budget. And these are senior citizens and everybody across the country who are saying, but this is really important to me that I'm a financial activist. I can't get out to a march or a rally because I'm in a wheelchair. But you know what? I want to give $25 to be able to help you out. So our small dollar donors actually now make up 60% of our budgets. Think about that. And so while there are attacks, and I have gotten some really disgusting and nasty ones as a woman, as a leader, some really horrific things that have been thrown at me. And the organization has received multiple threats. And we kind of just keep the file. And we know that these are things that are happening as a result of this president. But the thing that I will say has been great about this is the fact that we are still a people-powered organization, and people are still standing in their power, fighting back.
Thank you very much for that, Virginia. Next question is for Steve, but maybe Virginia can jump in as well. And it goes to this point about all of these organizations. And then Nancy in the chat, it's a very lively chat. People should look at it. She says, which is why I was shocked that law firms and universities backed down. So, Steve, like one of the things that was supposed to stabilize American democracy is our rich civil society, not just advocacy organizations for the People's Lobby like Common Cause, but the higher education organizations in which you and I have spent our lives, all of these civic organizations, maybe even law firms devoted to the profession of maintaining the rule of law. And that whole like layer of what we call civil society doesn't seem to be doing its thing. What we thought it would do and should do, many of us, for, a lot of decades in social theory and other things. So why isn't it doing its job? Is it that the government has much more power than we estimated? Or is it that so much of civil society is more gutless than we thought?
That is not only is that a great question, Archon. I think in some sense that is the question. I think very, very few of us going back to late last year would have anticipated the level of what I am calling abdication on the part of our most not everyday citizens, but the most influential, well-endowed, and prominent elites, whether it's university leaders, billionaires, media companies, powerful law firms, etc. There has been an extraordinary widespread abdication of the civic responsibility to stand up for democracy. And I think that's a huge social science puzzle. I don't think many of us, I certainly did not expect it. I'll leave it at that. And actually, I don't mean to punt, but my co-authors and I are writing a book on the collapse of U.S. democracy, and that is the central focus. I think we tentatively are entitling the book "The Great Abdication," and it's centrally about that. And we've just begun to try to come up with our answer. Let me just throw out two possibilities. One, I'm really struck by the fact that American elites have responded to this in a very different way than Brazilians or South Koreans or Germans. And I think that's not accidental. I think the fact that we in the United States, most of us anyway, have no collective memory of authoritarianism. We've never lost a democracy. We don't really know what it's like to live under authoritarianism. It really matters. I was talking to a Supreme Court justice in Brazil a couple of weeks ago, and he told me that as soon as Jair Bolsonaro was elected, he knew that this was a critical moment. And this is quoting him. He said, we could either be Churchill or we could be Chamberlain, and we didn't want to be Chamberlain. That he recognized from the outset the importance of standing up and defending democracy. And I think that the absence of any memory culture, any collective memory of authoritarianism is working here. I think most Americans, even to this day, still are overconfident in the strength of our institutions. They still don't believe that it can happen, that it can really happen here. I'm not talking about everyday Americans. I'm talking about the university presidents. I'm talking about major CEOs, politicians, still don't really believe that it can happen here. Brazilians all know that it can happen. Germans know that it can happen. I think that's part of it. The other is a collective action problem. When the leader of an individual organization, individual university, individual law firm, individual foundation, civil society organization is confronted with threats, the costs to the organization are enormous if you get punished, and it's very, very difficult to stand up. There's a very powerful pressure to make concessions, to acquiesce. It may seem to Columbia University like it's just making a few small concessions that really only apply to Columbia, and Paul Weiss may think it's not that big a deal, that it's making a set of small concessions. And so individual organizations, leaders of individual organizations, calculate that they can't afford to fight, that the cost of fighting is too much, and that they're making the individual concessions that they're making aren't that great. The collective outcome of that is a huge degree of concessions. A couple things. First of all, it emboldens the government. Every time Stephen Miller gets a win, he's encouraged to do it elsewhere, to replicate it elsewhere. But it also has a powerful deterrent effect on the rest of civil society. When Columbia stands down, when Paul Weiss stands down, when Paramount makes a deal, if Harvard were to ever, acquiesce, it sends a really powerful signal to the rest of civil society that, wow, either what they're doing must be okay,
Right.
or it's irresistible. If Harvard can't fight, then nobody's going to be able to fight. If Paul Weiss can't fend off the Trump administration, then how's my little puny law firm going to do it? And so it has really, really powerful ramifications. I think, just to wrap this up, it would be helpful if collective action is very hard, but it would be helpful if we had stronger associations, like most European democracies do, like even some Latin American democracies do, larger, more encompassing business associations, a stronger labor movement, associations, serious associations that bring together universities and university leaderships. In general, compared to other established democracies, even though we have a strong civil society, we don't have strong encompassing organizations. And that has, I think, hindered efforts at collective action. I mean, we've seen what's going on with universities. We've seen the government's strategy with respect to universities for 8 months now. And universities have not gotten much closer to any kind of collective response. They're barely even talking. And that's really damaging.
Yeah, thank you for that. Marcia in the chat says, we're on our own. Other orgs won't stick up for us. I think part of what I think is that the idea of civil society is supposed to be apart from government. But in America right now, and for the last few decades, the organizations that we think of, like universities and others, are not apart from government, right? There's so much interdependence there, which makes the leaders, dependent on what the government thinks. And that's part of it. And I've been really heartened by, quite apart from what the leaders do, what people in the organizations do, what people, Steve, what people at Harvard have done, our colleagues, and what many people who have joined Common Cause or the members of Common Cause have raised their hands and said, I will try to help. And so on that, Virginia, what has surprised you either about organizations or people who've not raised their hands and said, I want to help, who you thought would have on one side, and then on the more positive side, who's kind of raised their hands that you thought, oh, I didn't necessarily expect them to kind of step up for this, and I'm glad that they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really challenging moment for institutions because there are decisions that have to be made. The same question that you all asked of me, right, Archon, how much risk are you willing to take? And there are a lot of organizations who have a lower threshold for risk, and they think that by being quiet or putting their head in the sand, they're preserving the institution for the long term. And so one of the things that I will say in the nonprofit space, we, especially in the civil rights and democracy communities, we have been working really hard and very intentionally on what it means to stand in solidarity with one another. So there are groups who maybe weren't immigrant rights groups, that were democracy groups that say this is a core issue of democracy. We cannot put our head in the sand. If these attacks are happening on the immigrant community and on immigrant rights organizations, then we we need to stand in solidarity with them. If there is an attack and a fight on the LGBTQ community, we need to stand with them. If there is an attack on education, Common Cause ourselves, when we saw the law firms were starting to capitulate to Donald Trump, we worked with former employees of Paul Weiss and others to put out these letters, public letters, and to help them fight back, because this is a moment where it's all in and all in together. We cannot separate out. And so that's kind of been the approach. I think one of the things that has been really disappointing in this moment is seeing how corporate America has shown up. The interesting thing is you have a case like Target, right, where they have paid the price very heavily as a result of the boycotts of Target. But, people can only hold back for so long. And then they're like, it's the closest store, I have to go to Target. But we've seen how corporate America has really capitulated in a way that they're not realizing their economic power and strength in the markets. It's been really disappointing when you see the banking community, right, the finance sector, and them not speaking up when we're seeing what is happening even with our healthcare system. I mean, they've just recently decided that Medicare patients are going to get their decisions for procedures done by AI. Well, how that we've seen that didn't work before. We saw this in I think Tennessee recently, where they were making decisions around home care and how many hours of home care you would get. And it failed. It was horrible. It was miserable. So I think the disappointing part is that we're seeing people who talk about capitalism as a solution to a free market economy and a strong democracy who have actually been backtracking. I will say in the nonprofit sector, most of the folks that I work with, I am so proud of. I am so proud of what we saw with Harvard and even Georgetown, when they gave a very polite, I will say, a very polite FU letter to the legally written FU letter to the administration and saying no. And so I think what I fear most in this moment, though, is that we are getting to a point where people are comfortable with the acquiescing, with the capitulation, because they think that we just have to ride it out. We have to ride this wave until he's gone. And what they don't understand is that even if he is gone, there is a system that has been built. There is a new political party that has been built that is not the Republican Party that people remember from back in the day. And so now this is more, it has been institutionalized. And so the way that our country operates and the way that this party has moved the Republicans further and further to the hard right, the more likely it is that this has become part of the new norm. And so that, I think, is what's fearful for me.
Oh, good. Great. Thank you very much, Virginia. I want to move a little bit to elections and the 2026 and maybe 2028 election. And so Jacqueline, in the question and answer, teased this up by saying, why call it competitive authoritarianism when they clearly tilt the election playing field? What's competitive about it? And I want to tee it up a little bit more first for Steve, right? Because in your foreign affairs article, you say, look, elections are still going to happen. In competitive authoritarian societies, there are elections that happen. They're just not very fair for all these reasons. And maybe both Virginia and Steve can chime in on what the moves that might make it less fair are. So that's one possibility for 26 and 28. And we see that a little bit with the gerrymandering fights in Texas and California, et cetera. Another possibility that's kind of darker than the Steve Levitsky, Lucan Way vision is that it won't even be competitive authoritarian, right? So Venezuela tipped off into not even competitive authoritarian when last election, most people agreed that Maduro had lost. But then, he said, I'm not leaving. And so what about the possibility that 26 won't even be competitive authoritarian? It might be like, okay, the House hangs in the balance. Most people agree that these 3 House seats, the Democrats got more votes in those districts. And it's like the administration, like Donald Trump's 2020 calls, but they work this time, and those members aren't seated. That's no longer competitive authoritarian, right? That's just like authoritarian.
That's right. So, great questions. To begin, the reason why we call it competitive authoritarianism, these regimes are not perfectly competitive in that it's a perfectly level playing field. But there is a world that Lucan and I wrote a book on competitive authoritarianism 15 years ago. We first started writing about this almost 25 years ago. There's a world of political regimes that are not old-fashioned dictatorships. There are elections. The opposition is legal. The opposition is above ground. The opposition is competing in elections, and it's not a farce. The incumbent loses sleep the night before elections. There's a tilted playing field. There's all kinds of abuse, but the incumbents could lose, and sometimes the incumbent does lose. So there are lots of competitive authoritarian regimes in the last 30 years where the opposition actually wins the election. It wasn't a democratic election. It wasn't a democracy, but but there was enough space for the opposition to win. So I think there is a good chance that the U.S. playing field will be at least somewhat tilted in 2026. It's harder to tilt the U.S. playing field for a lot of reasons, but it may be tilted. But I'm pretty confident, and we'll get to your darker scenario, Archon, but I think most likely the it will still be a very contested election. That the Democrats, despite some disadvantages and the gerrymandering in Texas and possibly elsewhere is awful. I mean, it raises the real possibility that the Democrats could win more votes in the next election, but still not control the House, and that is what Orban did. So there will be disadvantages, but I think it'll be my guess is it'll be a fiercely fought battle, and that the Democrats will still have a chance to win. But yeah, it could be worse. I mean, I am both humbled and trying to learn from the fact that I have pretty consistently underestimated the threat. I mean,
Even you, even you.
even
Yeah.
me, it's been worse than I anticipated. Things are worse than when we wrote How Democracies Die. Things are worse than when we wrote the article in Foreign Affairs 9 months ago. And so, I've got to be aware of that. There are things that I would have confidently ruled out a few years ago that I can't. I still think they're somewhat unlikely, but can't rule them out. And it will be a close, even if it were a clean election, it's going to be a pretty close election. There is a real possibility of voter intimidation, either armed militia groups or ICE intimidating voters in close races that can matter. You mentioned the possibility of not seating candidates. That's a possibility. And Trump is discovering, when you really get to my nightmare scenarios, this applies to elections, but it applies across the board. Trump is discovering, the administration is discovering the key to actually creating a dictatorship in the United States is declarations of emergency. Because almost every constraint on the executive has some kind of an out, that if the president declares that it's a national emergency, he can sidestep these normal constraints. And Trump is learning that he can do that for anything. And he's also learning, I think, that the Supreme Court is not going to step in and say that this. I don't think this Supreme Court would ever set a precedent of saying to the executive branch, no, you got it wrong when you declared an emergency. They're always going to defer to the executive branch. And so I think the Trump administration is learning that it can declare emergencies potentially for almost anything. And so that could be a way of, I mean, in the worst case, even suspending elections, but seizing ballot boxes, overriding local and state authorities, and actually committing election fraud. Again, I don't think that's highly likely. There's still a number of guardrails in place to make that difficult, but it's possible.
Thank you. Virginia, this is kind of Common Cause's bread and butter. What do you see as, I mean, I think what Steve is, this last discussion, like elections that actually happen and to the extent possible are free and fair, that's on the critical path to democracy and democratic survival for sure. What do you see as the big risks to the 2026 election? Is it the militarization? Is it the gerrymandering? Because this is like Common Cause's bread and butter, and this is what you're asking chapters and thousands of people to participate in maintaining.
Yeah, I mean, so all of the above, I wish was like not the answer, but it really is. I will say a few things though. I think what a lot of people are forgetting is that our elections are run by the states, supposed to be, although we know this administration is trying to federalize in many ways their issues. But election administration is critical and important. And in each state, you are going to find that some states will have election systems that continue to be maintained in the way that they have been. But when you think about the threats to vote by mail, for example, making it harder, there are still opportunities for changes to be made to the election administration process in certain states. So the threats to vote by mail, the fact that there are many people who vote by mail and will not be able to vote by mail. When you think about what's happening with immigration enforcement right now, Supreme Court just came down with a decision today that supported the immigration enforcement that the administration is engaging in and going into cities, right? So imagine in places, especially in communities, in minority communities, where you have the risk of enforcement and the fear and the intimidation of coming out to the ballot when you no longer have an option to vote by mail or to vote early. You can imagine that is going to disenfranchise voters. That is a way to continue to concentrate power. The more fearful people are of coming out, the more likely they are just to not vote, because that voter kind of fear has set in. I think another thing that we need to be aware of, and these are things that feel like ancient history at this point, but the fact that CISA is no longer going to be sharing information with states about threats to election systems. So now you have states who do not have the resources to be able to be monitoring foreign interference on their own. When we know Donald Trump really has great relationships with a lot of these foreign strongmen. And so what is the likelihood that there might be some kind of an interference that would continue to try to prop him up? When we think about just in general, all of these things kind of combined together become the perfect storm. And then you have on top of it, we run something called the Election Protection Coalition. We are a co-chair, a co-convener, and we work with other nonprofits to make sure that people actually have access to the polls. So the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, they do an election protection hotline. We are working with folks in the field who are standing out there, making sure that voters have access while they're in line. If voting equipment goes down, we're trying to remedy that. When polling changes happen, we're out there. Well, this last election, we literally had Elon Musk sharing pictures of people, volunteers, who were just helping to make sure that people could access the polls and putting them online, having people doxxed. So even volunteers and people who have been a large part of the apparatus. The other thing that makes me very fearful is now that they've said that you can no longer, the attacks on third-party voter registration, people have been helping people for years and years and years. The League of Women Voters was the only organization that was able to be outside of naturalization ceremonies to be able to register new voters. I used to run that organization. Hundreds of thousands of people every year, just in 30,000 alone in Houston, Texas, were registering to vote after naturalization services. So you have all these new voters who now may not be able to register to vote, and the criminalization of some of this work. So all of this combined really puts a chilling effect, not only elections, but creates a sense of fear and mistrust ultimately voters have to feel like their vote is going to count. And if you have all of this combined, it really makes it harder for people to trust the outcome. And so all of those things together, I think, is what is I am fearful of, and the things that we have to continue to fight against as an organization. And then last, the mis and disinformation, that continues to be horrible. But at the end of the day, it's gone beyond mis and disinformation, and it has just become pure lies. Pure lies. We have to be able to say things for what they are, and the lies that exist and the propping up of lies. And I'm sorry, I'm going on about this because I feel very some kind of way. The acquiescing that the media, corporate media, has done around this. So the stories are not always being told. You see news entities like CBS and others who are just going to pay a fine because they don't want to deal with the fight. Well, at the end of the day, we're seeing the AP being booted out of the White House press room and having to go to court to be back in. People are not reporting the same way. You've seen Jeff Bezos and his intervention at the Washington Post, where the opinion section has now changed. We're seeing these things happen in real time, and this is one of those core pillars of democracy that if those stories are not being told, how will we even know? And so those are the things that we are working towards fighting against and hopefully continuing to have people engaged around. But these are all big challenges that we face this next election.
That's great. Thank you very much. And following up on those challenges, maybe Virginia first and then Steve. This is my last structured question. I've been weaving in some from the audience, but I'll do some more of that after this question. And people should type in questions in the Q&A function if you want to jump in. I won't be able to get to all of them because it's a busy Q&A. So there's a lot of people on this webinar. Probably a lot of people will watch it recorded. The appetite for many people to defend democracy is pretty clear. What can individuals do starting tomorrow to help strengthen and defend democracy? What would your one or two asks be?
One of the things that I would ask people is find a political home. We are a nonpartisan organization, but it doesn't mean we're not political. We are also what I like to call equal opportunity critics, in the sense that whether you're left and right, it's not about that, it's about right and wrong. So finding an organization where that is aligned with your beliefs, where you can show up and fight, whether it's a League of Women Voters, whether it's a Common Cause, NAACP, if it's, your National Association of Realtors and you're seeing what's happening to the housing market, whatever it is, I don't care. There is a home for you, but being engaged in community is more important than ever right now. And then finding a way to lean in on issues that are important for you. The other thing I would say people can do, and I know this sounds, I'm not putting a plug for funding, but financial activism is important. Organizations that are fighting back right now are struggling with resources because of the fear. And you need money to, just like you need electricity or gas to fuel a vehicle so it can move, these organizations require funding. And so even if it's $10, $15, being able to support, if you can't be out in the streets doing a protest like people were doing this weekend in Chicago and in DC, but finding a place where you can plug in and then being able to show up in the best way that you possibly can. And the most important thing I would say for folks to do is do not remain silent. Silence is complacency. So whatever it is that you can do, I'm seeing shout outs to a lot of our colleagues like Public Citizen and Individual and so many orgs on here. Having that home is important, and not being quiet. They can't put us all in jail. They can't stop us all. And this fear that we're going to be attacked. There are more of us who want to live in a country where there is a democracy that works for all of us than the people who don't. And so that safety in numbers matters. And so being able to be involved in an organization that you can be a part of, I think, is the most important thing you can do right now.
Great. Steve, do you have one or two asks? What do you think?
I know I'm supposed to present sort of alternative viewpoints, but I'm going to almost perfectly replicate what Virginia said. I think she's absolutely right. First of all, as an aside, the problem of fearful donors backing off of civil society is really critical, and so small scale donations are very, very important right now. Groups, if they're going to fight, need resources. And so anybody with the wherewithal to even make a small donation to the cause that you care about, very, very important. This is going to be, first of all, it's going to sound a lot like Virginia. Secondly, it's going to sound a little bit like a punt, but I mean it. It doesn't, there isn't a single strategy. There's not a single movement. There's not a single organization. So the most important thing is being engaged politically, and hopefully not just online. Online is important. It's part of our politics, but getting out and actually being part of an organization. And it doesn't matter too much what the cause is. But getting out and being involved is critical. There needs to be millions of people engaged in politics and ready to respond. We never know what strategy is going to work. You never know in advance what opposition strategy is going to work. Nobody would have thought protests at Tesla dealerships would end up being very effective.
True.
In Poland, the mass mobilization that really got people together and organized and in a position to defeat the Law and Justice Party was the abortion issue. That doesn't mean it'll be the abortion issue here. It might be something else. But what we have to do now is keep people engaged and collectively as a society just throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall. We don't know which strategies will work. And then again, to repeat what Virginia said, we've got to be a little brave. It's really important that we not get hysterical, that we not get scared into silence. Virginia's point that that collective action makes it a lot less scary for all of us is right on. But it's also true that this is a pretty inept government. It's a government that can do a lot of damage, but they're pretty inept. They make a lot of mistakes. They're not very effective, and so it's really, really important. Though we have to be aware of how this regime is undermining democracy. It's very important not to blow up the power and the threat that this administration poses, especially to individuals, and to be a little brave to go out and because no democracy has ever been saved from the sidelines. People have to defend it. Democracies cannot and never have defended themselves. When democracies are under threat, the Constitution doesn't automatically just operate. People have to step up and defend democracy, and that involves being a little bit brave. We know, most of us know nothing about what it takes, know nothing of the kind of bravery that Argentines and Brazilians and Chileans and Uruguayans and others across the world have endured to confront authoritarianism. The threats that we face is nothing compared to what friends of mine in South America have faced. So we have to be a little brave.
May I add to that? And I really appreciate you naming that, Steve. I think one of the things, as a reminder to folks, we really haven't been a full democracy until 1965, when the Voting Rights Act was passed. And there are a lot of elders in this country, people who lived through Jim Crow, who knew what authoritarianism looked like for a certain demographic of people, for Black people and many brown people in this country. And so there are people who have lived through authoritarianism here in the United States. And we want to make sure that we are utilizing their wisdom, their knowledge, the strategies that they used. A lot of times people think that it's just, we have to think of all of these new things. Some of this stuff is right there already. Mind you, we were fighting this country, they were fighting Jim Crow and McCarthyism at the same time. And so there are things that have happened that have given us kind of a peek or a glimpse into what is possible when we come together and fight back. And so I do think that that is something that every city, every state, you have people who are still fighting that. There are people who in the Muslim community and the Arab community, people in the Jewish community who have suffered greatly in this country as well. The Asian American community, the Japanese internment camps. It's not as though none of these things have happened. They just haven't happened all at the same time to everybody at once. And so now there's an opportunity even more so for us to take those lessons and then apply creative new solutions. But we can't be afraid of doing the things. And everything's not going to work. It's not going to be perfect, just like this administration has not been perfect because they have not been able to push everything they want through. The law has still held in some places. And sometimes they're just doing crazy things, for lack of a better term, that, actually they can't do. It's just not possible. We need to be as creative in our solutions and figuring out not only what worked, but how we can apply those lessons to the future.
That's great. Thank you. And I'm going to hop to Olivia has a really beautiful and difficult question. And I think it's important for like the three of us to hear given our generation. So Olivia says, Trump was first elected in 2016 when I was 13 years old. I don't remember politics before Trump. How can we move to a less volatile political environment when the generations coming into power don't know anything else other than this reality? And we've strategically not received quality history and pro-democracy civic education. I've seen little interest in genuinely engaging with young people from the political establishment in both parties. So how do you address somebody like who doesn't like normal politics for us? She's never known that.
I mean, that may be an advantage and a disadvantage. I do think it is somewhat unlikely that we will ever go back to the democracy that the three of us came of age under. Part of me still holds out hope that we'll build something better. In some ways, we're going to have to build something better. We were a real democracy between 1965 and at least 2021, but it had all kinds of important flaws, including an almost unspeakable degree of moneyed influence in politics, something that Common Cause has fought for decades. And so I think the younger generation can push our generation to be a little less conservative. I mean, I find myself always sort of defending Obama era democracy, and it's not good enough. We have to do better than that. You don't. It is helpful to have a democratic past that people can draw on, but there are many democracies. Every democracy was born for the first time. There are many modern democracies that were created by generations that never lived democracy themselves. And maybe the younger generation will push us to think forward about our democracy rather than look backward, which is I think a lot of middle-aged democracy defenders have a tendency to do.
Yeah.
Virginia, what would you say to Olivia?
I mean, as a fellow middle-aged democracy defender, I would say that I was a young person at one point, and I was very apolitical. I started as a community organizer, and my first issue that I really worked on was a follow-up case to Brown v. Board of Education called Chef versus O'Neill. I was one of the students in that school system in Hartford, Connecticut that was still going to segregated schools, and we just had no idea because it was just Black and brown kids, and that's where we went, and we didn't know that we were still living through segregation. And the reason I share that is because we knew that there was something better that was possible, and we were dealing with extreme violence. I grew up in a city where there was a 56% graduation rate when I graduated from high school. Some of the worst economic and education outcomes for young people. And we fought because we didn't see adults standing up for us. We didn't see older folks coming up with solutions. And so what did we start doing? We started organizing other young folks. We started putting together a vision for what was possible. We looked at all of the rules that existed and said, these aren't working for us. And we were able to create change. I actually started a nonprofit as a result. I co-founded a nonprofit for young people at the time. And I think going back to this idea of being courageous is really important for young people. Don't be fearful. When I started my nonprofit, I literally had to fill out the 501(c)(3) form by hand with ink pen. God knows how the IRS gave us that designation, because I'm sure the form wasn't great. But I would say I was not sophisticated enough at the time, or I won't say sophisticated enough. I didn't know enough. I wasn't jaded enough to think I couldn't do it. And I think right now that's the thing with young people is don't look for reasons why you can't change it. Don't look for those reasons. Don't look to people like us for all of the answers, because we've had our time. We're still doing the best we can, but clearly we haven't solved the problem. So my thing is being able to ask young people like yourself to show up, to train, to run for office. Being able to give an alternative. We are craving young people to be in office, to hold your elected leaders accountable, to ask the hard questions, to be engaged civically, and then to think about policy through a Gen Z lens, thinking about policy through a millennial lens, because those are the solutions that are still missing and not being heard, and then holding us accountable. It's okay to hold us accountable and say, you guys didn't get it right, and here's how we can make it better. Not to have an internal firing squad, but to think about how do we upgrade what already exists and the thought leadership that already exists so that you can build upon that so that we can have innovative solutions for the future.
Thank you very much. Very inspiring last question and last answers to that question. So the chat has been hugely lively. I'm going to get with the team and see if we can offer some summary of it to people who RSVP'd so that you can kind of get a sense of what's going on. I think it's probably a bad idea to have everybody's name in there, but we'll see what we can do in that regard. And it's been such a rich conversation and so much that we haven't been able to address. But I hope everybody's gotten something out of this. And I know I've gotten a lot of not just knowledge, but inspiration. And so deep, deep gratitude to both Steve and Virginia for joining in this discussion on the most important issue that there is in American society today. And we'll certainly be having more of these conversations. Thank you very much, Steve. Thanks, Virginia.
Thanks very much.
Have a great afternoon.